Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Rhonda Colvin, one of our Capitol Hill reporters. And today we're speaking with Tomiko Brown-Nagin. She just authored a book on Constance Baker Motley. And the title of that book is Civil Rights Queen, the story of Constance Baker Motley and the struggle for equality. And this is part of our series in the contribution that Black women have made to American history. So we thank you, Tomiko, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
And thank you to our viewers who are watching us right now. Remember, if you would like to tweet a comment or a question during this half hour, we're going to try to include some of those in this conversation. You can tweet those to our handle, Post Live. We'll go ahead and get started, Tomiko, because this is just a half hour, but Constance Baker Motley did so many things, so I'm hoping that we can really have an educational discussion here. Um, First off, what inspired you to write this first ever biography on Motley?
Yes, I was inspired to write about Motley when I encountered her during the writing of my book on Atlanta and the history of the civil rights movement. Motley litigated the Atlanta desegregation case all the way to the Supreme Court. And in seeking to draw readers into a discussion of the court case, I wrote a biographical sketch of Motley, during which time I realized that there was relatively little scholarly engagement with her legacy and her achievements, and I wanted to correct the historical record.
And, part of the hallmark of her early career is that she was a part of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund. Can you tell me how she got that job? You write that Thurgood Marshall hired her on the spot. Can you tell me how she got that job and what her time like was there?
Sure, happy to. Constance Baker Motley first applied to work at a New York City law firm, which is the most lucrative sector of the legal profession. And she essentially was turned away at the door. The white male partner did not want to hire a woman, certainly not a Black woman. And so she was delighted when she applied to be a student intern at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Marshall hired her on the spot, as I said, and treated her so differently than she had been treated by the white partner. He was friendly towards her. He told her about all the Black women in his life, including school teachers who were important, and was just happy to have her on board. And she was thrilled to get a dream job. And she worked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for 20 years.
And, most people know Thurgood Marshall, as the first Black justice on the Supreme Court, his work, of course, on so many landmark civil rights cases. What was her relationship with him like?
Sure. Well, they had great affection for one another and respected one another. I recount in my book how Marshall once gave an interview during which he said, Connie just walked in and took over, which suggests her impact on the Inc. Fund as well as his respect for her. He litigated alongside her, supported her career for 20 years at the Inc. Fund, and yet the relationship was complicated in some respects as well, in ways that it shouldn't be surprising to us because Motley was so ahead of her time in terms of the struggle for women's liberation. And I'm happy to talk about those incidents if you'd like.
Sure, yeah, elaborate on that.
Right. So Motley litigated, her first trial was in Jackson, Mississippi, where she litigated a salary equalization case on behalf of African American school teachers. First case, and it was one where I discussed how amazed people were to see her. She was an extraordinary, not only a Black lawyer or a woman lawyer, but a Black woman lawyer. Um, and yet, when she returned to New York, she found herself having to argue to Thurgood Marshall that her salary was not what it should be, given her contributions to the Inc. Fund. She also asked for a different title. And thus, one can see that she was fighting for herself the same battle that she had been fighting for her clients. And this is a theme that repeats across the book. The other incident that revealed the complications in their relationship occurred in 1961. I describe a setback in which Motley failed to win promotion to Marshall's job as the head of the Inc. Fund when he was appointed to the court. And she was disappointed by that. She thought race had something to do with that failure and gender as well, that Thurgood Marshall just could not imagine a woman as the head of this civil rights organization. And I think, again, that this illustrates how even in this amazing, historic organization fighting for civil rights, there were blind spots related to gender in Motley's estimation.
Yeah, that's so interesting. You kind of touched on this just now. You talked about how somewhat of a spectacle it was when she, appeared in a courtroom. Could you talk about, her physical characteristics and also the fact that she was a Black lawyer and a female lawyer, and the combination of the two you write was extraordinary at the time. How did people respond to that when they saw her?
That's right. They gawked at her, they scrutinized her, they were excited by her, and on her physical characteristics, she was striking, physically imposing, nearly 6 feet tall, attractive, reserved. I call her the civil rights queen, in part because she was regal in her demeanor, had been taught by her family, particularly her father, that she, as a West Indian, was superior to African American Blacks, and she carried herself in a way that commanded respect. And in Mississippi, when she litigated that first case, and even years later, when she litigated the desegregation case on behalf of James Meredith that broke Jim Crow at Ole Miss, people were just amazed at her. And she was litigating in the context of almost always being the only woman in the courtroom. And there she was as a lawyer, a traditionally male profession. Moreover, she was executing her skills in the context of local counsel. There was a local Black lawyer, and the NAACP always needed to have local counsel who, when he walked into the courtroom in Jackson, he displayed his inferiority, or the presumption of inferiority, and his inferior place in Mississippi society by walking with his back bent. And there she is, this woman standing tall, and it was just, it was amazing. People would come in, and Black people, some women, white women, to see her argue her case and see her do something that no Black woman was doing, no woman was doing, which is to ask white men, and it was typically white men, to account for discrimination in their communities.
And I think this kind of segues into a clip that we have. We have Baker Motley discussing how it was like to be a Black woman in this environment. Let's take a look.
In Mississippi generally, and throughout the South for that matter, it was the custom from slavery to address blacks either as boy or women by their first names. Black women were not accorded the dignity of being addressed as Miss or Mrs. And when I first went to Jackson, Mississippi in 1949, I think it was the Jackson Daily News was the name of the newspaper. They refused to address me as Mrs. Motley. They referred to me as the Motley woman. And some of the lawyers who opposed me in the cases which I I brought in Mississippi refused to address me as Mrs. Motley. And of course, that was something which surprised me a great deal because I wasn't accustomed to that, having been born and reared in New Haven, Connecticut, and living in New York. I knew about it, but when it actually happens, you are really shocked that any person who calls himself educated and professional, like a lawyer, would refuse to address another lawyer as Miss or Mrs. But that's what actually happened.
Tomiko, it's so striking to hear her say that and hear it in her own words. Did you find any sense that, those type of indignities that she had to encounter, that they affected her in any way, whether, professionally when she's arguing a case and meeting these indignities, or even personally, if it took a toll on her?
Sure. Thurgood Marshall taught Black lawyers not to react, not to show anger when they were verbally assaulted in the way that Motley just described. And she took that advice. She did not display anger. This was true when she was a lawyer. It was true when she was in politics. And it was true even when she was on the bench and sometimes encountered disrespectful counsel. And yet, in the context of Mississippi and those white male lawyers who were disrespectful to her, she did raise her voice in complaint. She asked the judge to instruct the lawyer to call her by her right name, and certainly not to refer to Motley as her or she, these indirect references that one of the lawyers used. And thereafter, he referred to Motley as the New York Council, which is an improvement, I suppose, but still a display of disrespect. I'm certain that Motley took notes and was affected in some way by those kinds of shows of disrespect. But there's something about her having been raised in New Haven by West Indian parents who taught her that she was superior that is important to note here. I argue in my book that while we don't often talk about that dynamic between West Indians and African American Blacks, so her father actually taught her that she was superior. They were superior to African Americans, particularly in the South. It actually was a protective armor for Motley. So in that clip, I think you can detect that she's truly bewildered by this man who wouldn't shake her hand, who wouldn't call her by her right name, because she had the attitude, well, I'm a graduate of Columbia Law School, and I'm from the Bakers of New Haven, and of course I should be accorded respect. And I think that kind of attitude was helpful to her throughout her careers.
Yeah, that's so thought-provoking. Talking about her, immigrant background and how that played into her journey into civil rights lawyer as well as politics. And we'll get to the politics part in a minute. But I want to ask about her role with Brown versus the Board of Education. So many of us were familiar with what that ruling was and its place in history, but not very familiar with her role in that case. Could you talk about how she worked on that case with Thurgood Marshall?
She was the only woman on the legal team that helped to litigate Brown versus Board of Education. And she was the person responsible for writing the original complaint in the series of cases that made up Brown. And she also helped on the legal briefs, doing legal research and even historical research. So she was right there in the thick of it when the lawyers, along with some of their allies, sociologists, historians, law professors, were working very long hours in the run up to their filing at the Supreme Court, having to or being expected to be away from their families for days at a time, just essentially living at work. Motley was there with them. And something that I thought it important to point out in my book is that in the same time that she is doing all of that work that went into the Brown versus Board of Education decision. She was pregnant. She gave birth to her son, and he was an infant and toddler. So she's balancing her career and balancing her home life. And you can imagine how difficult that was, including because it's still a relevant issue today. And I also point out that although Motley was a vital part of the team, she was behind the scenes. She did not actually argue any of the cases at the Supreme Court. And that too is important to note, even as I lift up the story of Constance Baker Motley, this woman being right there at the center of this great constitutional law case.
It's just astounding to know how pivotal Brown was and to not know that she was that involved in it and not to have heard of her name. So many people have not heard of her name or her contribution to history. Why do you think that is? Why do you think her contribution and mentions of her name aren't as well known as Thurgood Marshall or as others that she worked alongside?
It's a great question. And I would say it's because historical significance and leadership are essentially coded male. And so there are many men involved in the movement, not only Martin Luther King Jr. and Thurgood Marshall, who of course are rightly remembered and a part of the American historical landscape now, considered great leaders. A lot of people who frankly contributed less than Motley, who are better known. And a part of what I wanted to do in this book is correct the historical record and encourage readers to see the movement through the eyes of a woman, through the lens of gender, and connect Motley to a number of activist women at the time who also made contributions to the civil rights movement and who uh, more recently are receiving attention, but also suffered from a relative lack of attention. I'm thinking of Ella Baker, Pauli Murray, people of that nature, strong women who had tremendous impact, just like Motley.
Hmm. Motley went into politics, and I believe it was 1964. She was elected as the first Black female senator in the New York State legislature. Could you briefly talk about her road into politics and why she did that shift from being a civil rights lawyer to wanting to be involved with legislation and policy?
Sure, she thought by the early 1960s and certainly the mid 1960s that the arena of struggle for African Americans had shifted to politics, to the pursuit of voting rights and to the election of Black officials. And so she was open to the possibility when she was asked by Black and white male power brokers in New York City to run for office. I would imagine that it also may have been an interesting path for her to take because, after all, she had experienced that setback at the NAACP. She was the number two lawyer, and yet she understood herself to be a highly qualified person, and she took that plunge into politics. Now, I should say that although there were many people in the Democratic Party who saw her as a great asset, and she already had name recognition from her time as a lawyer, which is everything in politics, there were others in the Black community in New York who thought she should stay in her lane, that she was not, in fact, the best representative of African Americans, the most authentic representative of African Americans. But of course, she was not only representing African Americans, which is a point that she made, as she was a coalition builder and was on the forefront of the creation and the pursuit of multiracial democracy through that context of New York City.
Hmm. And then moving on to her being confirmed as the first Black female judge confirmed to a federal bench. Um, Tell me about her road to that, why she was chosen, and what she accomplished in that role.
Motley was chosen because she came to the attention of President Johnson, who was eager to make his mark as a pathbreaker in civil rights. She was highly recommended by the entire civil rights establishment for that judgeship, as well as by federal judges before whom she had argued, Supreme Court justices. And yet she did encounter some critics on the way to that nomination. People who said that although she was an experienced lawyer, her experience was in the field of civil rights, and thus they argued it was too narrow for a judge who would sit on the prestigious Southern District of New York federal court, which heard a lot of financial cases. It was essentially a question of whether she could handle those cases. The ABA rated her qualified instead of highly qualified, its highest rating, claiming that she had not argued in New York, which was remarkable and a farce, frankly, given the depth of her experience in federal courts throughout the country, and that was clearly a transferable set of experiences. And there were those who even brought up her race because there was a thought that it would be too political to appoint Motley to the bench at the same time as Thurgood Marshall was on the bench. And so she did encounter resistance from friends and certainly from foes like Senator James Eastland in Mississippi, the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee, who claimed that Motley was a communist because of her youthful left activism in New York. Ultimately, none of it stood in the way, but she had to run the gauntlet to get that seat.
Hmm. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about that confirmation experience that Motley had, because we are awaiting, news soon that President Biden will announce his pick for the Supreme Court vacancy, and we know he has confirmed that it will be a Black woman. Based on what you've been researching about Motley, what's been on your mind as we await this history-making moment from Biden?
Mm. Well, it's been a long time coming. Motley herself appeared on Supreme Court shortlists during the 1960s and early 1970s and had advocacy groups, including the National Women's Political Caucus, putting forth her name for the Supreme Court. She did not get the nod, including because the civil rights issue followed her. It was a double-edged sword, with some making the same kinds of arguments that she couldn't be fair to essentially white litigants in federal court. And so I'm thinking about that phrase, running the gauntlet. It's both a moment that, as I said, has been a long time coming, and Motley would be thrilled to see so many eminently qualified African American women be positioned for the nomination, and yet these processes they're fraught. We've seen rhetoric pushing back against the idea of the nomination of an African American woman, and so I feel cautious, and I know that someone will be confirmed by virtue of the simple math, and yet I do expect, and we're already seeing that there's a lot of scrutiny involved in these proceedings. And so I am cautiously optimistic and also pleased that we're at this moment validating the principle that Motley and so many other civil rights lawyers fought for and still fight for, and that is equal protection of the law, equal opportunity in the workplace. That moment has arrived.
Hmm. I wanted to get your thoughts on a quote that we had in the Washington Post. It was by a Georgetown student who said, having a Black woman on the Supreme Court could be a life-changing could be life-changing for the young Black girls coming behind me. Proof that what we believe for ourselves can come true. What does it mean for you, as someone who's researched this historical figure in Motley and this history-making moment that will be coming at the end of this month with Biden making a pick? These figures bringing their stories out, what do you think that tells the next generation?
Mm. Well, Motley was and is inspiring. And one of the reasons that I wanted to write this book and claim her rightful position in history is precisely because of the importance of visible diversity for all of the people for whom she stood in, women and immigrants and African Americans, working class. It's important for the full range of humanity to be represented in positions of power, which is why I can appreciate what the Georgetown student said there. At the same time, one theme of my book is about the price of the ticket, which is a way of suggesting that no one individual should bear the weight of social change for an entire race or gender or class of persons. The fit between representation and substantive outcomes is inexact, and I think that's true regardless of if the individual is Constance Baker Motley or this person who is going to be nominated to a court where there is a conservative supermajority and likely will be for some time. And so there are limitations on what that person could accomplish despite being on the highest court in the land.